What if I told you that the second most powerful office in America has been hiding bodies, duels, coups, and cover ups for over 200 years? That vice presidents, the guys we mostly forget exist until something happens to the president, have secretly shaped history in ways your textbooks conveniently skipped? You probably think the vice presidency is boring, a ceremonial seat, a guy who shows up at funerals and breaks Senate ties. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of these men shot people. Some ran secret business empires while in office. Some were investigated for crimes that would end careers today. And some straight up disappeared from public memory because what they did was too inconvenient to teach in school. I'm not talking about wild conspiracy theories here. I'm talking about documented history, court records, newspaper archives, and declassified files that got buried under centuries of dust because, frankly, nobody wanted to explain why a sitting vice president once killed a man in a duel and kept his job. Every fact you're about to hear actually happened. Some are stranger than fiction. A few are still debated by historians, and I'll flag those as we go, because I'd rather give you the full picture than a clean story. So before we start uncovering 50 forbidden facts about the men one heartbeat away from the presidency, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, because YouTube's algorithm buries videos like this one, and I need your help getting these stories in front of more people. Now get comfortable, because the history you were taught left out the good parts. Let's start with number 1. 1. John Adams and the original electoral system. Under the original Constitution, there was no separate ballot for president and vice president. Electors just voted for 2 people, and whoever came in second became vice president automatically. No running mates, no coordinated tickets, just whoever lost the presidential race by the smallest margin. In 1789, that meant John Adams became George Washington's vice president, despite the 2 men holding sharply different political philosophies. Adams was a strong Federalist who believed in a powerful central government and had deep suspicions about too much democracy. Washington, while officially above party politics, surrounded himself with Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, but the system essentially forced political rivals into the same administration. Adams found the job miserable. He famously called the vice presidency the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. He had almost no formal power beyond breaking Senate tie votes, and Washington rarely consulted him on major decisions. Adams spent 8 years mostly on the sidelines, watching history happen without him. The system got even messier by 1796. When Adams ran for president himself, his own vice president ended up being Thomas Jefferson, a man who fundamentally opposed almost everything Adams believed in politically. Imagine an administration today where the president and vice president belong to completely opposing parties and philosophies, unable to agree on basic governance, yet forced to serve together because of how the electoral math worked out. That's exactly what happened. The flaw was obvious almost immediately, but it took the disaster of 1800 to actually force change, which brings us to our next entry. 2. Thomas Jefferson's tied election. The election of 1800 exposed just how broken the original electoral system really was. Thomas Jefferson ran for president with Aaron Burr, intended as his running mate for vice president. The problem was that the Constitution still didn't distinguish between votes for president and votes for vice president. Electors simply cast 2 votes each, and Jefferson's supporters, coordinating badly, gave both Jefferson and Burr the exact same number of electoral votes. 73 each. Under the rules at the time, a tie like that sent the entire decision to the House of Representatives, where each state delegation got 1 vote. This wasn't a minor procedural hiccup. It triggered a genuine constitutional crisis. Burr, who was technically supposed to be the vice presidential candidate, refused to formally step aside and let Jefferson claim the presidency outright. Some historians argue Burr was simply following the letter of the law and doing nothing wrong by staying in the race. Others claim he was maneuvering behind the scenes to steal the presidency for himself, though the evidence on his true intentions remains debated. What's certain is that the House of Representatives took 36 separate ballots over several days to break the deadlock. Rumors of bribery, backroom deals, and political threats swirled through Washington. Alexander Hamilton, despite despising Jefferson's politics, worked behind the scenes to prevent Burr from winning, viewing Burr as the more dangerous and unprincipled option of the 2. Eventually, Jefferson secured enough support to become president, with Burr settling for the vice presidency he was originally meant to hold all along. This entire mess directly led to the 12th Amendment in 1804, which finally created separate electoral ballots for president and vice president. But the damage to the relationship between Jefferson and Burr was already done, and Burr's political career was about to take an even darker turn. 3. Aaron Burr's duel with Hamilton. Just months after becoming vice president, Aaron Burr found himself locked in a bitter personal feud with Alexander Hamilton, the same man who'd worked to block his path to the presidency during the 1800 crisis. The tension between them had been building for years, fueled by political rivalry, personal insults, and Hamilton's repeated public attacks on Burr's character. In 1804, while running for governor of New York, Burr's campaign collapsed partly due to comments Hamilton allegedly made questioning his integrity. Burr demanded an explanation. Hamilton refused to fully retract his statements. Under the code of honor that governed elite men at the time, this left dueling as the accepted path forward. On July 11, 1804, the two men met at Weehawken, New Jersey, a spot notorious for duels because New York had outlawed them. Shots were fired, Hamilton was struck and died the following day. Burr survived unharmed. What makes this almost unbelievable is that Burr was still the sitting vice president of the United States when this happened. He hadn't resigned, hadn't been removed. He simply returned to Washington and finished out his term while facing murder charges in two separate states. Those charges eventually faded away, partly due to jurisdictional confusion and partly because dueling, while frowned upon, wasn't always aggressively prosecuted. Burr's political career, however, was effectively finished. The public backlash was severe. He later became entangled in a separate conspiracy involving accusations of trying to establish an independent territory in the western United States, leading to a treason trial where he was ultimately acquitted. To this day, historians debate exactly what Burr's true ambitions were during that later scheme. But the duel itself remains one of the most jaw-dropping facts in American political history. A sitting vice president killed one of the founding fathers and kept his job. 4. George Clinton's two presidents. After the constitutional chaos of the 12th Amendment finally sorted out how presidents and vice presidents got elected, you'd think the office would settle into something more predictable. George Clinton had other plans, or rather history had other plans for him. Clinton holds a distinction no other vice president can claim. He served under two completely different presidents from two different political eras. First, he was Thomas Jefferson's vice president, starting in 1805, stepping into the role after Aaron Burr's spectacular fall from grace made him politically radioactive. Clinton was already an old political warhorse by then. He'd been governor of New York for an astonishing 18 years, longer than almost anyone in American history at that point. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, a fierce anti-federalist, and a man who genuinely believed in states holding more power than the central government. That put him somewhat at odds with the Jeffersonian vision, but he served competently enough as a kind of elder statesman presence in the administration. Then something remarkable happened. When Jefferson's second term ended, Clinton didn't retire. He got re-elected as vice president again, this time under James Madison, starting in 1809. Two different presidents, two different administrations, one vice president bridging the gap between them. Clinton was in his 70s by this point, ancient by the standards of early American politics, and his health was clearly declining. Some historians suggest he barely functioned in the role during his second term, showing up rarely and contributing little to actual governance. He reportedly grew increasingly bitter and disillusioned, having once harbored his own presidential ambitions that never materialized. Clinton had actually run against Madison for the presidency in 1808, while still serving as sitting vice president under Jefferson, an almost unthinkable move by today's political standards. He lost badly, but stayed on as vice president anyway, then somehow ended up as Madison's running mate the very next cycle, despite having just tried to take his job. Clinton finally died in office in 1812, becoming the first vice president in American history to die while holding the position. His death left the vice presidency vacant for the remainder of Madison's term, since the Constitution at the time offered no mechanism for filling the role mid-term. The nation simply went without a vice president until the next election cycle. Clinton's dual service under Jefferson and Madison remains a strange historical footnote, a reminder that the early vice presidency was less about political loyalty to one leader and more about experience, seniority, and regional balance. Whether Clinton's later years in office represented dedicated public service or a slow fade into irrelevance while clinging to power depends on which historian you ask. 5. Elbridge Gerry and gerrymandering. Speaking of vice presidents who left behind legacies they probably never wanted, Elbridge Gerry managed to get his name permanently attached to one of the most cynical practices in American politics, and he wasn't even the one who invented it. Gerry served as vice president under James Madison starting in 1813, taking over after George Clinton's death left the position empty. But Gerry's real claim to infamy happened years earlier, back when he was governor of Massachusetts in 1812. That year, Gerry signed off on a heavily manipulated state Senate district map designed specifically to benefit his own political party by packing opposition voters into as few districts as possible while spreading friendly voters across many others. One particular district near Boston was drawn in such a wildly contorted, snake-like shape that a newspaper cartoonist decided to have some fun with it. The cartoonist added wings, claws, and a head to the district's outline, turning it into a mythical-looking creature and dubbing it a salamander. Combine that with Gerry's name and you get gerrymander, a term that's stuck around in American political vocabulary for over 2 centuries now. The irony here is almost too perfect. Gerry himself reportedly wasn't thrilled about the map, and some accounts suggest he actually had reservations about signing it, viewing it as politically necessary rather than something he personally championed. Whether that's historically accurate or a bit of reputation management added later remains debated among historians. What's not debated is that the practice worked exactly as intended. Gerry's party won a disproportionate number of state Senate seats that year, despite receiving fewer overall votes statewide, a direct result of how the districts had been drawn. Gerry went on to become vice president under Madison just months later, though his time in the role was brief and largely uneventful compared to the controversy that made his name famous. He died in office in 1814, becoming the second vice president in American history to die while serving, following Clinton by only 2 years. That meant Madison, like Jefferson before him, finished out a presidential term without a vice president at all. Gerry's actual vice presidential legacy is barely remembered today. What survives instead is a word describing the exact kind of political manipulation that continues to shape American elections to this day, still used, still controversial, and still argued about in courtrooms and legislatures across the country. 6. John C. Calhoun's resignation. If Clinton and Gerry showed that dying in office was an occupational hazard for early vice presidents, John C. Calhoun demonstrated that walking away entirely was also very much on the table. Calhoun served as vice president under 2 different presidents just like Clinton before him, first under John Quincy Adams starting in 1825, then continuing on under Andrew Jackson after the bitterly contested election of 1828. That alone made him politically unusual, a vice president who survived a complete change in administration and party direction. But Calhoun's relationship with Jackson deteriorated badly over time, driven by both personal rivalry and deep policy disagreements, particularly over an issue that would eventually push the entire nation towards civil war decades later, states' rights versus federal authority. The immediate crisis came to be known as the nullification controversy. South Carolina, Calhoun's home state, passed legislation declaring that it had the right to nullify federal tariffs it considered unconstitutional and economically harmful to Southern interests. Calhoun secretly authored much of the political theory behind nullification, arguing that individual states retained the authority to reject federal laws they deemed illegitimate. Jackson viewed this as a direct threat to the Union itself and responded with genuine fury, reportedly threatening to personally lead troops into South Carolina if necessary. With tensions boiling over and his political future under Jackson essentially finished, Calhoun made a decision no vice president had made before. In December of 1832, he resigned from the vice presidency entirely, becoming the first person in American history to leave the office voluntarily rather than dying, losing re-election, or finishing out a term. Calhoun didn't resign to disappear from politics, though. He'd already arranged to take a seat in the United States Senate, representing South Carolina, essentially trading one position of national influence for another, where he could fight the nullification battle more directly. Some historians frame this as a principled stand for states' rights and constitutional interpretation. Others argue it was fundamentally about protecting the economic interests tied to slavery in the South, since tariffs and federal authority were deeply intertwined with the plantation economy Calhoun represented. That underlying tension, states' rights framed as constitutional principle versus states' rights as a defense of slavery, would resurface again and again in the decades leading up to the Civil War. Calhoun's resignation set a precedent that later vice presidents would eventually follow under very different circumstances, proving that the office wasn't necessarily a life sentence or a stepping stone to the presidency. Sometimes it was simply a position you could walk away from when the political winds shifted hard enough beneath you. 7. Martin Van Buren's American birth. After a string of vice presidents who died in office, resigned in protest, or straddled multiple administrations, Martin Van Buren offered something almost refreshingly simple, a genuine historical first that had nothing to do with scandal or crisis. Van Buren became vice president under Andrew Jackson in 1833, stepping into the role that Calhoun had just abandoned amid the nullification fallout. But Van Buren's real distinction predates his time in office entirely. He was born in Kinderhook, New York in December of 1782, several months before the Treaty of Paris officially ended the Revolutionary War and secured American independence from Britain. That timing matters enormously. Every vice president before him, Adams, Jefferson, Burr, Clinton, Gerry, and Calhoun, had been born as British subjects living in colonies still under the crown. Van Buren was the first person to hold the office who came into the world as an American, born into a nation that, at least on paper, already understood itself as separate from Britain. It's a small detail in the grand scheme of his political career, but it carried real symbolic weight at the time. The founding generation was aging out of power, and Van Buren represented something genuinely new, a leader shaped entirely by American institutions rather than colonial memory. He grew up speaking Dutch at home, since his family descended from early Dutch settlers in the Hudson Valley, which made him also the first vice president, and later the first president, whose first language wasn't English. Van Buren built his political career almost from scratch, working as a lawyer and rising through New York's notoriously cutthroat political machine before becoming one of the chief architects of the modern Democratic Party, alongside Jackson himself. He was clever, calculating, and endlessly adaptable, earning nicknames like the Little Magician for his ability to maneuver through political disputes that would have destroyed less careful men. As vice president, he served loyally under Jackson, using the position as a launching pad for his own presidential ambitions, which he successfully achieved in 1837. Whether his birth after independence actually shaped his political worldview in any meaningful way is debatable, and historians differ on how much symbolic significance to place on an accident of timing. Some argue it simply made him a generational curiosity, a bridge figure between the revolutionary founders and the more partisan, machine-driven politicians who followed. Others suggest his lack of first-hand connection to British rule made him more comfortable with the kind of aggressive party politics that Jackson's era ushered in, since he had no personal memory of monarchy to measure democracy against. What's certain is that Van Buren's presidency, which followed his vice presidency, coincided with one of the worst economic depressions in American history up to that point, the Panic of 1837, which arguably did more to define his legacy than his birth certificate ever did. Still, being the first vice president born a citizen rather than a subject remains a genuinely unique footnote, a reminder that even something as simple as a birth date could carry historical weight in a nation still figuring out exactly what being American meant. 8. Richard Mentor Johnson's controversial family. If Van Buren represented a quiet generational shift, his own vice president, Richard Mentor Johnson, brought something far more explosive to the office, a personal life that scandalized even the notoriously rough and tumble politics of the 1830s. Johnson served as Van Buren's vice president starting in 1837, a Kentucky politician and war veteran who claimed, with fairly shaky evidence, to have personally killed the Shawnee leader Tecumseh during the War of 1812. That claim alone made him something of a folk hero in certain circles, but it wasn't what made him controversial. What truly set Johnson apart, and what nearly derailed his political career entirely, was his long-term relationship with Julia Chin, a woman he had inherited as property through his father's estate. Johnson never married Chin, since interracial marriage was illegal in Kentucky at the time, but he openly treated her as his common-law wife for decades, raising their two daughters together, and according to numerous accounts, publicly acknowledging them as his children in a society that expected such relationships to remain hidden. He reportedly tried to introduce his daughters into Kentucky society and even sought respectable marriages for them, an almost unthinkable act of defiance against the racial norms of the era. This openness, rather than earning any kind of grudging respect, generated fierce backlash. Southern political figures were horrified. Some newspapers attacked him relentlessly, and his relationship with Chin became a significant liability during his vice presidential campaign. Julia Chin died of cholera in 1833 before Johnson ever took office, but the controversy surrounding their relationship followed him regardless. His nomination as Van Buren's running mate was so contentious that the Democratic Party's electors couldn't reach a majority for him in the Electoral College, a genuinely rare occurrence. Johnson became the only vice president in American history elected by the Senate itself, under the provisions of the 12th Amendment, rather than through the standard electoral process. Once in office, Johnson largely faded into political irrelevance, spending significant time away from Washington and struggling to shed the stigma attached to his personal life. He was dropped from the Democratic ticket entirely in 1840, and Van Buren ran for re-election without a vice presidential nominee at all. Whether Johnson deserves recognition for a rare public acknowledgement of a relationship many powerful men of his era kept hidden, or whether he simply represents the deeply exploitative dynamics of slavery dressed up as domestic devotion, remains a genuinely contested question among historians. What's undeniable is that Johnson's family life made him one of the most polarizing vice presidents of the early republic, a man whose personal choices generated more political fallout than almost anything he did in office. 9. John Tyler's party expulsion. Few vice presidents managed to alienate their entire political party quite as thoroughly or quite as quickly as John Tyler did after ascending to the presidency itself. Tyler became vice president in 1841 as William Henry Harrison's running mate, part of the famous slogan "Tip and Tyler too." Harrison, however, died just 31 days into his term, the shortest presidency in American history, thrusting Tyler into the Oval Office under circumstances the Constitution hadn't clearly addressed. Tyler asserted, somewhat controversially at the time, that he was now the actual president rather than some kind of temporary caretaker, setting a precedent that later vice presidents would rely on. But Tyler's real trouble started almost immediately afterward, once he began governing according to his own political instincts rather than the Whig Party platform that had gotten him elected. The Whigs, led by the powerful Senator Henry Clay, expected Tyler to support their agenda, particularly plans to reestablish a national bank, something Andrew Jackson had famously destroyed years earlier. Tyler, who held genuinely different economic views closer to old-school states' rights democratic thinking, vetoed the Whig banking bills, not once but twice. Clay and his allies were furious, viewing Tyler's vetoes as a fundamental betrayal of the party that had put him in office. In a move without precedent in American history, the Whig Party formally expelled Tyler from the party in September of 1841, just months after he'd become president. His entire cabinet, with the sole exception of Secretary of State Daniel Webster, resigned in protest shortly afterward. Tyler suddenly found himself as a president without a party, governing essentially as an independent for the remainder of his term, unable to rely on either Whigs or Democrats for consistent support. Some historians framed this as principled constitutional conservatism, arguing Tyler genuinely believed the national bank exceeded federal authority and stuck to his convictions despite enormous political pressure. Others describe him as simply stubborn and politically tone-deaf, a man who never understood he'd been elected to support someone else's vision rather than his own. Whatever the motivation, the expulsion left Tyler almost entirely isolated in Washington, a president technically leading a nation while belonging to no party at all. He didn't seek re-election in 1844, recognizing he had no realistic path forward with either major party. Tyler's presidency remains a strange case study in what happens when the accidental successor refuses to simply follow the script written for him, a reminder that inheriting power and inheriting loyalty are two very different things entirely. 10. George M. Dallas's decisive tariff vote. After Tyler's messy divorce from his own party, the vice presidency settled into a quieter stretch, though not one without genuine consequence, and George M. Dallas offers a perfect example of how the office's most obscure constitutional power, the tie-breaking Senate vote, could reshape the entire economy. Dallas served as vice president under James K. Polk, starting in 1845, a Pennsylvania politician with a long resume in law and diplomacy, including a stint as ambassador to Russia. Pennsylvania in the 1840s was an industrial powerhouse, home to iron foundries, coal mines, and textile mills that depended heavily on protective tariffs to keep foreign competition at bay. Dallas's own political base expected him to defend those tariffs fiercely, since his career had been built on Pennsylvania support, and Pennsylvania industry expected loyalty in return. Instead, in 1846, when the Senate found itself deadlocked over a bill to significantly lower tariff rates, Dallas cast the deciding vote in favor of reduction. The bill, known as the Walker Tariff, reflected Polk's broader vision of freer trade, a philosophy that clashed directly with the protectionist instincts of Dallas's home state. The backlash in Pennsylvania was immediate and brutal. Newspapers accused him of betraying the very industries that had built his political career. Effigies of Dallas were reportedly burned in protest, and his standing within Pennsylvania politics never fully recovered. Some historians argue Dallas simply prioritized loyalty to Polk and the national Democratic platform over narrow regional interests, viewing himself as a national officeholder rather than a Pennsylvania delegate once he held the vice presidency. Others suggest his vote reflected genuine economic conviction, a belief that lower tariffs would benefit the country's growing trade relationships, even if it hurt his home state in the short term. Whatever his reasoning, the vote illustrates something easily overlooked about the vice presidency, that its most concrete constitutional power isn't ceremonial at all. The ability to break Senate ties has occasionally reshaped major legislation, and Dallas's decision proves that a single vice presidential vote could override regional loyalty and reroute national economic policy entirely. Dallas finished his term without seeking higher office, his political ambitions largely stalled by the controversy. He later returned to diplomatic work, serving as minister to Great Britain, a role that let him quietly step away from the tariff fight that had defined his vice presidency. Whether Pennsylvania's anger was justified or simply the predictable result of parochial politics clashing with national policy remains debatable, but the episode remains one of the clearest examples of how a supposedly powerless office could, under the right circumstances, tip the scales on issues affecting millions of American workers and businesses. 11. Millard Fillmore's empty vice presidency. If Dallas's story shows the vice presidency exercising real power, Millard Fillmore's story shows what happens to the office once that power gets removed entirely, sometimes for years at a stretch. Fillmore became vice president under Zachary Taylor in 1849, another largely uneventful stint until Taylor died suddenly in July of 1850, likely from a severe stomach illness, thrusting Fillmore into the presidency less than 2 years into the term. Fillmore governed for the remainder of Taylor's term, notably signing the Compromise of 1850, a fragile set of laws attempting to manage the growing sectional divide over slavery. But the more overlooked consequence of Fillmore's sudden ascension involves the office he left behind rather than the one he inherited. The Constitution at the time contained no mechanism for filling a vacant vice presidency. Once Fillmore moved into the presidency, the vice presidency simply sat empty, and it remained that way for the rest of his term, nearly 3 full years until 1853. This wasn't unusual for the era. Every previous vice president who ascended to the presidency, from Tyler onward, left the same vacancy behind, and nobody in Congress seemed particularly motivated to fix the structural gap. The problem wouldn't be formally addressed until the 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967, over a century later, finally establishing a clear process for presidential nomination and congressional confirmation of a new vice president. Until then, the nation simply operated without a vice president whenever the office fell vacant, whether through death, resignation, or succession, sometimes for years, leaving the line of succession dangerously unclear if anything had happened to the sitting president. Some historians argue this vacancy reflected a genuine constitutional oversight, an assumption by the founders that succession crises would be rare enough not to require detailed planning. Others suggest lawmakers at the time simply lacked the political will to tackle the issue, since filling the vacancy would have required amending the Constitution during an era already consumed by slavery and sectional tension. Fillmore's presidency ended in 1853 without ever having a vice president by his side, a strange footnote to a term already defined by crisis management. He failed to secure his party's nomination for a full term afterward, and later ran unsuccessfully as the American Party's candidate in 1856. The empty vice presidency during his term stands as a quiet reminder that constitutional gaps don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they simply linger, unnoticed and unresolved, until circumstances force the nation to finally confront them more than a century later. 12. William R. King's Cuban Oath. Few vice presidential inaugurations carry the strange, almost tragic quality of William R. King's, a ceremony that took place not in Washington but on foreign soil, thousands of miles from the Capitol building where such oaths were supposed to be administered. King was elected vice president alongside Franklin Pierce in 1852, capping a long career that included stints as a senator from Alabama and ambassador to France. By the time of his election, however, King was already gravely ill with tuberculosis, a disease with no effective treatment in the 1850s beyond rest, climate change, and hope. Seeking relief from the illness, King traveled to Cuba, where the warmer climate was believed to offer some therapeutic benefit for consumptive patients. He was too sick to return to the United States for the standard inauguration ceremony in March of 1853, creating a genuine constitutional puzzle. Congress responded by passing special legislation allowing King to take the vice presidential oath abroad, a wholly unprecedented arrangement. On March 24, 1853, King took the oath of office near Matanzas, Cuba, becoming the only vice president in American history sworn in on foreign soil. The ceremony did little to improve his condition. King returned to the United States shortly afterward, traveling back to his home in Alabama, where he died on April 18, just over 3 weeks after taking office. He never set foot in Washington as vice president, never presided over the Senate, and never performed any of the office's official duties. Some historians view King's Cuban Oath as a poignant example of the lengths early American institutions were willing to go to preserve constitutional continuity, bending procedure just enough to accommodate an extraordinary personal circumstance. Others see it as a somewhat futile gesture, a ceremonial nicety extended to a man who everyone involved understood was already dying, more symbolic than substantive. King's death left the vice presidency vacant for the remainder of Pierce's term, echoing the same structural gap that had plagued Fillmore's presidency just years earlier. Whether Congress should have anticipated these repeated vacancies sooner, given how frequently the office seemed to sit empty during this era, remains a fair question for historians to debate. What's certain is that King's brief, geographically improbable vice presidency stands as one of the strangest footnotes in the office's history, a reminder that even the most formal constitutional procedures occasionally had to yield to the messy, unpredictable realities of illness, distance, and mortality. 13. John C. Breckinridge's age record. After decades of vacancies, deathbed oaths, and constitutional improvisation, the vice presidency eventually found itself occupied by someone almost absurdly young for the role, and Breckinridge's story offers a fascinating counterpoint to everything that came before it. Born in Kentucky in 1821, Breckinridge built a rapid political career, serving in the state legislature and then the House of Representatives before being selected as James Buchanan's running mate in the election of 1856. When he took the oath of office in March of 1857, Breckinridge was just 36 years old, making him the youngest vice president in American history, a record that still stands today. To put that in perspective, the Constitution doesn't even set a minimum age for the vice presidency the way it does for the presidency, an oversight some legal scholars argue was simply an assumption that the office would naturally attract older, more established statesmen. Breckinridge shattered that assumption entirely. His youth made him something of a political sensation at the time, a telegenic, articulate figure representing a new generation of Southern Democratic leadership during an era when sectional tensions over slavery were reaching a boiling point. Some historians suggest Buchanan's team specifically wanted a younger running mate to balance his own advanced age and appeal to voters looking toward the future rather than the past. Others argue Breckinridge's selection was more about regional politics, an attempt to secure border state support during an increasingly fractured national coalition. Whatever the calculation, Breckinridge spent much of his vice presidency navigating an administration paralyzed by the growing crisis over slavery's expansion into new territories, a conflict Buchanan largely failed to resolve. After his term ended in 1861, Breckinridge's path took a dramatic turn. He briefly served as a United States Senator from Kentucky before siding with the Confederacy, eventually becoming a Confederate general and eventually the Confederacy's Secretary of War, a trajectory that transformed him from the youngest vice president in American history into one of its most controversial post-vice presidential figures. Some historians frame his defection as a natural extension of his Southern political identity, while others argue it represented a genuine betrayal of the oath he'd taken just years earlier. Breckinridge fled the country after the Confederacy's collapse, living in exile in Europe and Canada for several years before eventually returning to the United States under an amnesty. He never held elected office again, spending his remaining years practicing law in Kentucky until his death in 1875. His youth record remains an oddity of American political history, a reminder that the vice presidency has occasionally been filled by figures whose subsequent choices dramatically reshaped how their early achievements would be remembered. And speaking of vice presidents whose political usefulness eventually ran out, Abraham Lincoln's handling of his own running mate midway through the Civil War offers a strikingly cold-blooded example of political calculation overriding personal loyalty. 14. Hannibal Hamlin's replacement. Hannibal Hamlin served as Lincoln's first vice president, starting in 1861, a former senator from Maine chosen largely to balance the Republican ticket geographically and ideologically, pairing Lincoln's more moderate Midwestern profile with a New England politician known for strong anti-slavery convictions. Hamlin performed his duties competently enough, presiding over the Senate during some of the most turbulent years in American history, though the vice presidency at the time still carried little actual power beyond that ceremonial function. By 1864, however, with the Civil War dragging on and Lincoln facing a genuinely uncertain re-election campaign, the political calculus around the ticket shifted dramatically. Some Republican strategists argued that Lincoln needed to rebrand his campaign as a broader, more unified war effort, one that could appeal to war Democrats and border state voters who might otherwise abandon him. Dropping Hamlin, a committed Republican from a safely Republican state, and replacing him with Andrew Johnson, a pro-Union Democrat from the border state of Tennessee, seemed like a strategic masterstroke designed to project unity rather than pure Republican partisanship. The National Union Party ticket, as it was officially called that year, aimed to demonstrate that support for preserving the country transcended traditional party lines. Hamlin understandably felt blindsided by the decision, having served loyally for nearly 4 years only to be discarded for what many viewed as a purely tactical maneuver. Some historians argue the swap reflected legitimate political necessity, a calculated risk that helped secure Lincoln's decisive victory in November of 1864. Others suggest the decision was short-sighted, given how catastrophically it would matter just months later. Hamlin returned to Maine, later serving again as a senator, while Johnson took the oath as vice president in March of 1865. 6 weeks later, Lincoln was assassinated, and the man chosen largely for political optics suddenly found himself leading a fractured nation through the earliest, most contentious years of Reconstruction. Whether Hamlin would have handled that transition differently remains one of the great unanswerable questions of the era, but the swap itself stands as a clear example of how vice presidential selections, even ones dressed up as principled unity moves, often boiled down to cold political strategy with consequences nobody could have fully anticipated. And speaking of Andrew Johnson's dramatic and unexpected rise to power, it's worth remembering that his elevation almost didn't happen at all, for reasons far more sinister than shifting political winds. 15. Andrew Johnson's missed assassination target. The plot that killed Lincoln in April of 1865 wasn't originally designed as a single assassination, but as a coordinated decapitation of the federal government's top leadership, and Johnson himself was supposed to be among the victims that night. John Wilkes Booth's conspiracy assigned separate targets to different conspirators, reportedly hoping to eliminate Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward simultaneously, throwing the government into total chaos during the war's final, fragile weeks. The man assigned to kill Johnson was George Atzerodt, a German immigrant and boatmaker who had been recruited into Booth's broader scheme. largely because of his knowledge of escape routes through Confederate sympathizing territory in Maryland. Atzerodt reportedly took a room at the Kirkwood House, the same hotel where Johnson was staying, positioning himself for what was supposed to be a coordinated strike timed alongside Booth's attack at Ford's Theater. According to later testimony, Atzerodt lost his resolve entirely, spending the evening drinking at the hotel bar instead of carrying out the assignment, apparently unable to bring himself to commit murder despite his involvement in planning the broader conspiracy. Some historians argue Atzerodt was simply the weakest link in Booth's plot from the start, a reluctant participant swept along by circumstance, rather than genuine ideological commitment. Others suggest his hesitation reflected a broader truth about the conspiracy, that several of Booth's recruits were far less prepared for actual violence than Booth himself. Whatever the explanation, Johnson survived the night entirely unaware that an assassin had been stationed just floors away. Atzerodt fled Washington after Lincoln's assassination became public, but he was captured within weeks, tried alongside the other conspirators, and executed by hanging in July of 1865. Johnson, meanwhile, was sworn in as president just hours after Lincoln's death, thrust into leading a nation trying to reunify itself while simultaneously grieving its assassinated leader. The missed attempt on his life remains a strange historical footnote, a reminder of how close the plot came to eliminating the entire executive line of succession in a single coordinated night, and how one man's failure of nerve inadvertently spared the country from an even deeper constitutional crisis than the one it already faced. 16. Schuyler Colfax and Crédit Mobilier. Few political falls from grace in American history were as swift or as complete as Schuyler Colfax's, and his story remains a cautionary tale about how quickly public trust can evaporate once financial scandal enters the picture. Colfax rose through Indiana politics with genuine popularity, eventually becoming Speaker of the House before being selected as Ulysses S. Grant's running mate in 1868. He was widely liked, known for his affable personality and reputation for honesty, qualities that made the accusations against him all the more shocking when they surfaced. The Crédit Mobilier scandal centered on a construction company connected to the Union Pacific Railroad, one that had allegedly overcharged for construction costs while funneling discounted stock to sympathetic members of Congress in exchange for favorable treatment and silence. When the scheme became public in 1872, investigators found that Colfax had allegedly received shares and dividend payments while serving as Speaker, years before he became Vice President. Colfax denied any wrongdoing, insisting the payments in question were unrelated loans or legitimate transactions, and some historians have since argued that the evidence against him was murkier than his critics claimed, built more on suspicion and guilt by association than on solid proof. Others maintain that the paper trail, however incomplete, strongly suggested he'd accepted stock in exchange for political favors. Whatever the truth, the scandal effectively ended his political career. Grant quietly dropped him from the ticket in 1872, replacing him with Henry Wilson, and Colfax never held elected office again. He spent his remaining years giving paid lectures about Abraham Lincoln, trying to rebuild his reputation through nostalgia rather than politics. He died in 1885, his name forever tied to one of the Gilded Age's defining corruption scandals, a reminder that even a vice president admired for his personal charm couldn't escape the shadow of alleged financial impropriety. And speaking of vice presidents who replaced disgraced predecessors only to bring their own peculiar backstory to the office, Henry Wilson's personal history offers a strange twist that had nothing to do with scandal at all. 17. Henry Wilson's name change. Before he became a senator, a labor reformer, or eventually Ulysses S. Grant's second vice president, Henry Wilson wasn't actually born Henry Wilson at all. He entered the world in 1812 as Jeremiah Jones Colbath, born into poverty in New Hampshire, under circumstances he apparently found humiliating enough to want erased entirely. Accounts suggest his father was an alcoholic day laborer, and young Jeremiah was indentured as a farm laborer for much of his childhood, receiving little formal education and even less financial security. At the age of 21, having legally completed his indenture, he petitioned the New Hampshire legislature to change his name entirely, adopting the name Henry Wilson, reportedly inspired by a deceased child from a family he'd once worked for. Some historians suggest the name change represented a symbolic rebirth, a deliberate attempt to shed a childhood marked by poverty and hardship and start fresh with an identity of his own choosing. Others argue it reflected something more practical, a desire to distance himself from a family reputation he found embarrassing as he began building a career in shoemaking and eventually politics. Whatever his exact motivation, the reinvention worked. Wilson built a successful shoe manufacturing business, became a passionate abolitionist, and eventually rose to the United States Senate, where he spent nearly 2 decades advocating for anti-slavery causes and labor rights. By the time Grant selected him as a running mate in 1872, few voters knew or cared that the distinguished senator from Massachusetts had once been a New Hampshire farm boy born under an entirely different name. Wilson's vice presidency was cut short by declining health, and he suffered a stroke in the Capitol building itself in 1873, eventually dying in 1875 while still in office. His name change remains one of the more unusual personal footnotes among the vice presidents, a quiet reminder that not every path to national office began the way the history books suggest. And speaking of vice presidents whose personal choices reflected an unusual relationship with money, William Wheeler's approach to his own compensation stood in stark contrast to the corruption swirling around some of his contemporaries. 18. William A. Wheeler's salary refusal. If Schuyler Colfax's story demonstrated how easily a politician's reputation could be tarnished by allegations of financial impropriety, William Wheeler's career offered something like the opposite example, a politician seemingly determined to avoid even the appearance of profiting excessively from public service. Before becoming Rutherford B. Hayes's vice president in 1877, Wheeler served for years in the House of Representatives, where he reportedly became known for a level of personal frugality that struck some colleagues as unusual, even eccentric. According to popular accounts repeated by biographers and contemporaries, when Congress voted itself a controversial salary increase in the early 1870s, sometimes referred to derisively as the Salary Grab Act, Wheeler declined to accept the raise for himself and reportedly returned the additional funds to the United States Treasury. Some historians treat this story as a well-documented example of Wheeler's genuine commitment to fiscal restraint, while others note that the precise details of the refusal are harder to verify than the popular narrative suggests, cautioning that some anecdotes about 19th century politicians tend to grow more polished with each retelling. Whatever the exact specifics, Wheeler's reputation for personal modesty was widely acknowledged even by his critics. He lived simply, avoided ostentation, and was reportedly uncomfortable with the pomp associated with high office, a trait that some contemporaries found admirable and others considered almost comically restrained for a man serving as Vice President of the United States. Hayes himself was said to respect Wheeler's frugality, even joking privately that his running mate's modest habits made him an unusually low-maintenance partner in an administration otherwise consumed by disputes over Reconstruction policy and a bitterly contested election. Wheeler's vice presidency was largely uneventful in terms of formal power, as was typical for the era, but his personal reputation for financial restraint left a distinct impression on those who worked alongside him. He returned to private life after leaving office in 1881 and died just a few years later in 1887, remembered less for policy achievements than for a quiet insistence on living and governing within his means. And speaking of vice presidents whose time in office proved far too brief to leave much of a mark, Thomas Hendricks holds a peculiar distinction of his own, one that echoes the pattern of premature death that seemed to follow the vice presidency throughout the 19th century. 19. Thomas A. Hendricks's brief tenure. By the time Thomas Hendricks took the oath of office as Grover Cleveland's vice president in March 1885, he'd already built a long and respected career in Indiana politics, serving as a congressman, a senator, and later governor of the state. He was a leading voice within the Democratic Party for decades, someone whose name had appeared on presidential shortlists more than once before he finally landed on the national ticket. Supporters saw him as a seasoned statesman who could help balance the ticket geographically and ideologically, and his selection was viewed by many at the time as a shrewd political move. But whatever plans Hendricks had for his vice presidency were cut tragically short. He suffered from declining health even before assuming office, and some historians suggest he may have known his condition was serious, though the exact details of what ailed him remain somewhat murky in the historical record. Less than 9 months after being sworn in, on November 25, 1885, Hendricks died suddenly at his home in Indianapolis. Reports at the time cited heart failure, though the specifics were never entirely clear, and rumors swirled for years about whether his health had been misrepresented to the public during the campaign. His death left the vice presidency vacant for the remainder of Cleveland's first term, a situation that wasn't unusual for the era, since there was no constitutional mechanism at the time to fill a vacancy in the office. The country simply went without a vice president until the next election cycle. Some historians point to Hendrix's death as part of a broader troubling pattern in the 19th century, one where the vice presidency seemed almost cursed by a string of untimely deaths, resignations, and successions that left the position vacant more often than most Americans probably realize. Others argue this reads too much into what was simply an unfortunate coincidence involving the medical realities of the era, when sudden death from cardiac or other undiagnosed conditions was far more common across all walks of public life. Whatever the explanation, Hendrix's brief tenure meant he accomplished little of note while in office, overshadowed almost entirely by the manner and speed of his departure from it. He remains one of several vice presidents whose story is defined less by what they did in the role and more by how quickly the role slipped away from them. And speaking of vice presidents whose ambitions extended well beyond the office itself, Levi Morton's story offers a glimpse into what happens when a vice president tries to climb one rung higher and finds the ladder unexpectedly out of reach. 20. Levi P. Morton's failed presidential bid. Levi Morton arrived at the vice presidency in 1889 already a wealthy and successful figure, having built a career as a prominent banker before entering politics, and he served under Benjamin Harrison during a term that included the admission of several new states to the Union. Morton's tenure as vice president was generally seen as competent, if unremarkable, and he presided over the Senate during a period of intense legislative activity without generating much personal controversy. But Morton had ambitions that stretched beyond the vice presidency, and after leaving office in 1893, he set his sights on the presidency itself, seeking the Republican nomination in 1896. By then, Morton had also served as governor of New York, adding executive experience to his resume and giving him what some supporters considered a legitimate case for the top job. He entered the race believing his financial background and political experience made him a credible contender, someone who could appeal to the party's business-friendly wing at a time when economic issues, particularly the debate over gold versus silver currency, dominated national politics. Unfortunately for Morton, the Republican Party had other plans. William McKinley, with a far more organized campaign operation and stronger backing from party power brokers like Mark Hanna, secured the nomination instead, effectively ending Morton's presidential aspirations. Some historians argue Morton's campaign suffered from a lack of the kind of aggressive, modern political organizing that McKinley's team pioneered, while others suggest Morton himself, already in his early 70s by that point, simply lacked the energy or desire to fight as hard as a younger candidate might have. Either way, the loss marked the end of his national political career. Morton returned to private life and his banking interests, living out his remaining decades largely removed from politics, eventually passing away in 1920 at the remarkable age of 96, one of the longest-lived vice presidents in American history. His failed presidential bid remains a footnote, a reminder that even a successful vice presidency and a respectable political resume didn't guarantee a path to the top of the ticket. And speaking of vice presidents whose careers followed an unusually disjointed path through the highest levels of government, Adlai Stevenson, the first, experienced something almost no other person in American history has, serving in the same office under the same president twice, with an entire term in between where he held no office at all. 21. Adlai Stevenson eyes non-consecutive terms. Grover Cleveland remains the only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, and that unusual circumstance created an equally unusual situation for Adlai Stevenson I, whose political career became permanently linked to Cleveland's strange up-and-down trajectory. Stevenson first entered national politics as a congressman from Illinois, building a reputation as a loyal Democrat with strong ties to the party's patronage networks. When Cleveland won his first term in 1884, Stevenson was appointed to a position within the administration, and his connections to the party establishment made him a natural choice when Cleveland sought a running mate for his second, non-consecutive term in 1892. Stevenson served as vice president from 1893 to 1897, presiding over the Senate during a turbulent period marked by economic depression and intense debates over currency policy. Some historians point out that this arrangement was historically unusual even by the standards of the era, since Stevenson technically served under Cleveland during only one of Cleveland's 2 terms, despite the association between the two men stretching back years earlier through Stevenson's earlier administration role. After leaving the vice presidency in 1897, Stevenson didn't retire from politics entirely. He later ran unsuccessfully for vice president again in 1900 on the ticket with William Jennings Bryan, and even attempted a run for governor of Illinois years afterward, though both efforts ended in defeat. His grandson and namesake, Adlai Stevenson II, would go on to become a prominent Democratic presidential candidate in the 1950s, arguably surpassing his grandfather's political legacy in the public memory. Some historians view the elder Stevenson's career as a case study in the strange, winding nature of 19th century political patronage, where loyalty to a single dominant figure like Cleveland could carry a politician through decades of shifting fortunes. Others simply note that his story, tangled up in one of only 2 non-consecutive presidencies in American history, ensures he'll always occupy an unusual footnote in the constitutional history books, a vice president whose service was defined almost entirely by the peculiar math of Grover Cleveland's improbable political comeback. And speaking of vice presidents whose influence quietly outpaced the modest expectations of the office, Garrett Hobart's story suggests that sometimes the person standing next to the president ends up shaping policy far more than the history books tend to remember. 22. Garrett Hobart as McKinley's partner. When William McKinley chose Garrett Hobart as his running mate in 1896, few people outside New Jersey political circles knew much about him. Hobart was a successful lawyer and businessman with deep ties to railroad and banking interests, someone who'd built his fortune and reputation largely outside the national spotlight. He'd never held federal office before becoming vice president, which made what happened next all the more surprising. Rather than fading into the ceremonial background that had swallowed so many vice presidents before him, Hobart became one of McKinley's closest confidants, someone the president genuinely trusted and consulted on major decisions. The 2 men reportedly got along extremely well personally, and Hobart's calm, businesslike temperament seemed to complement McKinley's more cautious political style. He and his wife Jenny became fixtures of Washington's social life, and Hobart himself began attending cabinet meetings, an almost unheard of practice for a vice president at the time, since the office had traditionally been kept at arm's length from actual executive decision-making. Some historians argue that Hobart's proximity to McKinley during the lead-up to the Spanish-American War in 1898 gave him real influence over policy discussions happening at the highest levels, and journalists of the era reportedly started referring to him informally as the assistant president, a nickname that stuck precisely because it seemed to reflect genuine political reality rather than exaggeration. Whether Hobart actually shaped major decisions or simply had a front-row seat to them remains a point of some debate among historians, since the records from the era are frustratingly incomplete when it comes to documenting exactly what was said behind closed doors. What isn't in dispute is that Hobart represented a meaningful shift in how the vice presidency could function, showing that the office didn't have to be entirely powerless if the president in question was willing to share the stage. Unfortunately, Hobart's growing influence was cut short by his health. He suffered from heart disease that worsened throughout his term, and he died in office in November 1899, leaving the vice presidency vacant for the remainder of McKinley's first term, a now familiar pattern given how often the 19th century vice presidency turned into an early grave. McKinley reportedly mourned Hobart's death deeply, describing him as an irreplaceable partner rather than simply a subordinate official. Some historians view Hobart's brief but unusually active tenure as an early blueprint for what the vice presidency could eventually become in the 20th century, a genuine advisory role rather than a ceremonial afterthought. Others caution against reading too much modern significance into what may have simply been a close personal friendship between 2 men who happened to work well together. Either way, Hobart's death opened the door for McKinley to choose a new running mate in 1900, a decision that would carry far greater historical weight than anyone could have anticipated at the time. And speaking of unexpected historical weight landing suddenly on the shoulders of a vice president, the man McKinley chose to replace Hobart would find himself thrust into the presidency itself under the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. 23. Theodore Roosevelt's sudden promotion. When William McKinley won re-election in 1900, his new running mate was Theodore Roosevelt, a young, energetic, reform-minded governor of New York, whose popularity with voters made him politically useful, even as some Republican Party bosses privately worried about his independent streak. Party boss Thomas Platt, in particular, reportedly wanted Roosevelt out of New York state politics entirely, and pushing him toward the vice presidency, an office widely viewed at the time as a political dead end, seemed like the perfect way to neutralize him. Roosevelt himself had reservations about taking the job, reportedly telling friends he worried it would sideline his career rather than advance it. He accepted anyway, and for several months, it looked like Platt's plan had worked exactly as intended. Roosevelt spent much of his time delivering speeches and performing largely ceremonial Senate duties, seemingly filed away from the center of national power. Then, in September 1901, everything changed. McKinley was shot by an anarchist assassin while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He initially seemed to be recovering, and Roosevelt, believing the crisis had passed, went on a planned camping trip in the Adirondacks. McKinley's condition suddenly worsened, and Roosevelt had to be tracked down and rushed back to civilization, reportedly traveling by horse-drawn wagon down mountain roads in the middle of the night to reach a train that would carry him to Buffalo. McKinley died before Roosevelt arrived. At just 42 years old, Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history up to that point, a record that still stands today when it comes to succession by circumstance rather than election. His presidency represented an enormous shift from the cautious, business-friendly approach that had defined McKinley's administration. Roosevelt pursued trust-busting antitrust cases against major corporations, championed conservation efforts that permanently reshaped the American landscape, and expanded the role of the federal government in ways that alarmed many of the same party bosses who'd hoped to sideline him in the first place. Some historians argue that Roosevelt's sudden ascension fundamentally changed how Americans viewed the vice presidency, proving almost overnight that the office was never more than a single bullet away from the presidency itself. Others point out that Roosevelt's particular blend of charisma and political skill made his transition unusually smooth compared to other accidental presidents throughout history. Whatever the interpretation, Platt's plan to neutralize Roosevelt by burying him in the vice presidency backfired about as spectacularly as any political maneuver in American history possibly could. And speaking of vice presidents whose names ended up permanently stamped onto the American map, long before anyone knew how their political careers would ultimately unfold, Charles Fairbanks left behind a legacy that many Americans encounter every day without realizing where it actually came from. 24. Fairbanks, Alaska's namesake. Charles Fairbanks served as vice president under Theodore Roosevelt starting in 1905, a respected senator from Indiana, known for his conservative fiscal views and his steady, unremarkable demeanor, which stood in fairly stark contrast to Roosevelt's famously boisterous personality. But years before Fairbanks ever took the national stage as vice president, his name had already been attached to a small trading post in the remote interior of the Alaska Territory. In 1901, explorer and trader E.T. Barnett established a settlement along the Chena River, intending it as a supply stop for prospectors, and when a gold rush suddenly transformed the tiny outpost into a bustling boomtown, local judge James Wickersham suggested naming the growing settlement after Fairbanks, who was then a rising political figure and influential senator with connections that could prove useful to the fledgling territory's development. The name stuck, and Fairbanks, Alaska grew rapidly, eventually becoming one of the largest cities in the state, a hub for gold mining, later oil development, and eventually a key waypoint along the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Some historians note the naming reflected a fairly common practice of the era, where distant territories sought to curry favor with powerful senators and congressmen who controlled funding, statehood negotiations, and infrastructure decisions that could make or break a remote settlement's future. Whether the naming ever directly benefited the town in terms of federal support remains somewhat unclear, though Fairbanks did go on to have a long career supporting territorial and infrastructure interests during his time in the Senate. What's particularly interesting is that most Americans today who recognize the city of Fairbanks, whether through news coverage of extreme winter weather, the aurora borealis, or its role as a gateway to Denali National Park, have likely never made the connection to the vice presidential namesake behind it. Fairbanks himself never actually visited the city that bore his name, and by the time he became vice president 4 years after the settlement's naming, The connection between the politician and the boomtown was already fairly well established in the public consciousness of the territory. Some historians view this as a small but telling example of how vice presidents, often overlooked in the broader sweep of American history, occasionally left permanent marks on the physical landscape of the country in ways far more enduring than most of their actual policy achievements. Others simply see it as a quirky footnote, a reminder that sometimes lasting legacy has less to do with what a vice president accomplished in office and more to do with being politically useful at exactly the right moment to exactly the right frontier judge. And speaking of vice presidents whose place in history came down to nothing more than tragic timing, James Sherman's story is a reminder that sometimes death doesn't wait for a campaign to finish, let alone an election. 25. James S. Sherman's death during an election. James Sherman served as vice president under William Howard Taft starting in 1909, a genial New York congressman known for his skill at presiding over the Senate and his talent for staying on good terms with pretty much everyone in Washington, which made him a popular if unremarkable choice for the ticket. By 1912, Taft selected Sherman to run alongside him for a second term, even though Sherman's health had been quietly declining for months due to Bright's disease, a serious kidney condition that today would likely be caught and treated far more aggressively than the medicine of the era allowed. Sherman tried to continue campaigning as best he could, but his condition worsened steadily throughout the fall, and just 6 days before the election, on October 30th, 1912, he died at his home in Utica, New York. The Republican National Committee found itself in an unprecedented and frankly bizarre situation. There was no time to formally replace Sherman on the ballot in most states, so Taft technically ran the final stretch of his re-election campaign, with a deceased running mate still listed as his vice presidential candidate. Electors who ended up voting for the Republican ticket were instructed to cast their vice presidential votes for Nicholas Murray Butler, president of Columbia University, who the party quietly designated as Sherman's replacement after the fact. It didn't end up mattering much in practical terms, since Taft finished a distant third behind Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party run, making 1912 one of the strangest three-way races in American political history. Some historians point out that Sherman's death barely registered as a major news story at the time, overshadowed almost completely by the dramatic split within the Republican Party and Roosevelt's insurgent campaign against his own former party. Others argue that the incident exposed a genuine gap in American election law, since there was essentially no formal mechanism in place for handling the death of a candidate so close to Election Day, a gap that arguably still hasn't been fully addressed even now. Sherman remains the only vice presidential candidate in American history to die during an active campaign for re-election, a distinction nobody would ever want, but one that quietly reshaped how parties think about contingency planning during a race. And speaking of vice presidents caught in impossible situations where doing nothing may have been the most consequential decision of all, Thomas Marshall found himself facing a crisis that the Constitution simply hadn't prepared anyone to handle. 26. Thomas Marshall and Wilson's stroke. Thomas Marshall served as vice president under Woodrow Wilson, starting in 1913, a folksy Indiana politician best remembered for his quip that what this country needs is a good 5-cent cigar, a line that pretty well summed up his generally low-key approach to the office. In October 1919, Wilson suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed, cognitively impaired, and largely incapacitated for months, an incredibly serious medical crisis that the public knew almost nothing about at the time. Wilson's wife Edith and his physician effectively controlled access to the president, deciding what information reached him, what documents he saw, and who was allowed anywhere near him. An arrangement some historians have since described as a kind of unofficial presidency, operating entirely outside constitutional norms. Marshall, meanwhile, was kept largely in the dark about the true severity of Wilson's condition, receiving only vague reassurances that the president was recovering and would resume his duties soon. Even when it became increasingly clear that Wilson was in no condition to govern effectively, Marshall refused to assume presidential powers or push for a formal transfer of authority. Some historians argue Marshall feared that acting unilaterally, without a clear constitutional process for declaring a president incapacitated, something the 25th Amendment wouldn't formally establish until decades later, could trigger a genuine constitutional crisis or make him look like he was staging a power grab against a sitting president. Others suggest Marshall simply lacked the political will or ambition to force the issue, content to let Wilson's inner circle manage the situation rather than risk the appearance of disloyalty. Whatever the reasoning, the result was that the United States effectively had no fully functioning president for well over a year, with major decisions either delayed indefinitely or quietly made by Edith Wilson and a small handful of trusted aides. Marshall reportedly joked privately about the absurdity of his position, but the situation exposed a genuine and alarming gap in the constitutional framework governing presidential succession. It would take until 1967 for the 25th Amendment to finally establish clear procedures for presidential incapacity, a reform many historians directly trace back to the chaos and uncertainty of Wilson's final years in office. And speaking of vice presidents thrust into the presidency under circumstances nobody could have planned for, Calvin Coolidge's path to the Oval Office involved a scene so quiet and rural, it almost sounds like it belongs in a different century entirely. 27. Calvin Coolidge's Midnight Oath. Calvin Coolidge served as vice president under Warren Harding starting in 1921, a notoriously quiet and reserved Massachusetts politician whose reputation for saying as little as possible earned him the nickname Silent Cal. In August 1923, Coolidge was visiting his family's modest farmhouse in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, a home that famously had no electricity or telephone service at the time, when word arrived in the middle of the night that President Harding had died suddenly of a heart attack while traveling in San Francisco. With no phone available to reach federal officials and no easy way to verify the situation quickly, Coolidge's father, who happened to be a notary public and local justice of the peace, administered the presidential oath of office to his own son by the light of a kerosene lamp at approximately 2:30 in the morning. The scene, a president being sworn in by his father in a farmhouse parlor without electricity, has become one of the most vividly remembered moments in the history of presidential succession, precisely because it stood in such stark contrast to the formal, ceremonial swearing-in most Americans associate with the office. Some legal scholars at the time raised questions about whether a state notary actually had the constitutional authority to administer a federal presidential oath, concerns serious enough that Coolidge quietly took the oath a second time after returning to Washington, this time in front of a federal judge, just to remove any lingering doubt about the legitimacy of his presidency. Coolidge himself reportedly saw nothing unusual about the makeshift ceremony, later writing that it seemed perfectly natural for his father to administer the oath given the circumstances, and consistent with his generally unpretentious approach to power and governance. Some historians view the midnight swearing-in as a fitting symbol of Coolidge's broader political identity, a plain-spoken, frugal leader who preferred quiet competence over spectacle. Others point out that the incident exposed yet another gap in the constitutional understanding of presidential succession, one of several such gaps that would only become fully addressed decades later. Either way, the image of a future president taking his oath by lamplight in a farmhouse remains one of the more oddly humble beginnings to any presidency in American history. And speaking of vice presidents whose midnight oaths and quiet dignity gave way to entirely unexpected legacies, Charles Dawes proved that sometimes the most unlikely path to lasting fame runs straight through a piano rather than a podium. 28. Charles Dawes's hit song. Charles Dawes served as vice president under Calvin Coolidge, starting in 1925, a gruff, cigar-chomping banker and general known for his short temper, his colorful vocabulary, and his role in crafting the Dawes Plan, which restructured Germany's World War I reparations payments and earned him a Nobel Peace Prize. What almost nobody expected from a man best known for finance and foreign policy was a career as a composer. But in 1911, years before he ever held national office, Dawes sat down and wrote a piano and violin piece called Melody in A Major, apparently as something of a personal hobby rather than any serious artistic ambition. The tune was pleasant, simple, and largely forgotten outside of a modest circle of classical music enthusiasts for decades, tucked away as a minor curiosity in the biography of a man who went on to bigger things in banking and government. Then, in 1951, songwriters Carl Sigman added lyrics to the melody, transforming it into a pop song called It's All in the Game. The song became a massive hit when Tommy Edwards recorded it in 1958, and it shot to number 1 on the Billboard charts, eventually earning its status as one of the most successful songs of that era. Some music historians point out that Dawes remains the only vice president in American history to receive songwriting credit on a number 1 pop hit, an odd little footnote that rarely makes it into standard political biographies. Others note that Dawes died in 1951, the same year the lyrics were added, meaning he never actually got to hear his obscure piano composition become a chart-topping sensation embraced by an entirely new generation of listeners. The song has since been covered by artists ranging from Nat King Cole to Van Morrison, keeping Dawes's melody alive in popular culture long after most people forgot he'd ever been vice president at all. It's a strange kind of immortality, outlasting his political achievements and even his Nobel Prize in terms of sheer cultural reach, proof that legacies in Washington don't always turn out the way anyone expects them to. And speaking of vice presidents whose personal backgrounds quietly broke new ground long before the country was ready to fully acknowledge it, Charles Curtis carried a heritage that made him a genuine first in the history of the office. 29. Charles Curtis's Call heritage. Charles Curtis served as vice president under Herbert Hoover, starting in 1929, a Kansas politician whose mother, Ellen Papin, had documented ancestry connecting her to the Kaw Nation, making Curtis the first vice president in American history with acknowledged Native American heritage. Curtis spent part of his childhood living on the Kaw Reservation with his maternal grandmother after his mother's early death, an experience he later referenced publicly, though how central it was to his personal identity throughout his adult political career remains something historians continue to debate. His path from reservation life to national office was, by any measure, an unusual one for the era, involving stints as a jockey, a lawyer, and eventually a longtime member of Congress representing Kansas for decades before ascending to the vice presidency. Some historians argue Curtis's heritage was quietly downplayed during his political rise, since prevailing attitudes of the time toward Native Americans were often openly hostile or dismissive, and emphasizing that background too heavily could have proven a political liability. Others point out that Curtis himself sometimes references ancestry in public settings, seemingly comfortable acknowledging it rather than actively concealing it, which complicates any simple narrative about erasure or shame. His time in office coincided with ongoing federal policies that continued to marginalize Native communities, an irony not lost on later observers examining the gap between having a Native American vice president and the treatment of Native peoples more broadly during that same period. Curtis advocated for some Native American interests during his congressional career, though his overall record on indigenous policy remains a mixed and contested one depending on which historian you ask. He remains, to this day, the only vice president with documented Native American ancestry, a distinction that took decades before mainstream history books gave it much attention at all. And speaking of vice presidents whose loyalty to their own president eventually reached a breaking point, John Nance Garner's relationship with Franklin Roosevelt soured into one of the more dramatic political rivalries of the era. 30. John Nance Garner's break with Roosevelt. John Nance Garner served as vice president under Franklin Roosevelt starting in 1933, a blunt-talking Texan and former Speaker of the House, who initially helped deliver crucial support for Roosevelt's nomination, only to grow increasingly disillusioned with the New Deal's expanding scope over the following years. Garner, a fiscal conservative at heart, reportedly grew uneasy with what he viewed as excessive government spending, growing federal power, and Roosevelt's increasingly cozy relationship with organized labor, tensions that steadily widened into open disagreement. By 1937, the relationship had deteriorated further after Garner publicly opposed Roosevelt's controversial plan to expand the Supreme Court, a fight that left lasting scars between the two men and their respective camps within the Democratic Party. Matters came to a head in 1940 when Roosevelt broke with tradition and pursued an unprecedented third term, prompting Garner to break from the ticket entirely and mount his own campaign for the Democratic nomination against the sitting president he'd served for 2 terms. Garner's challenge went nowhere in practical terms, garnering only a small fraction of delegates' support at the convention, but it marked a striking and rare instance of a sitting vice president openly opposing his own president's renomination. Some historians view Garner's break as a principled stand against what he saw as dangerous concentration of executive power. Others argue it reflected personal resentment after years of feeling sidelined and ignored within an administration that increasingly left him out of major decisions. Garner reportedly grew so frustrated with the largely ceremonial nature of the vice presidency that he once described the job in famously unflattering terms, a remark still quoted by political scientists whenever the relevance of the office comes up for debate. After his failed challenge, Garner quietly retired from politics altogether, spending the rest of his long life back in Texas, occasionally offering blunt, unsentimental assessments of the administration he'd once helped elect. And speaking of vice presidents whose personal correspondence came back to haunt them in ways they never anticipated, Henry Wallace's fondness for letter writing to a rather unconventional spiritual advisor turned into a full-blown political scandal. 31. Henry Wallace's Roerich letters. Henry Wallace served as vice president under Franklin Roosevelt starting in 1941, an idealistic agricultural scientist and progressive reformer whose deep interest in spirituality, mysticism, and Eastern philosophy led him into correspondence with Nicholas Roerich, a Russian artist, mystic, and self-styled guru who cultivated a devoted following in certain elite circles during the 1930s. Wallace wrote Roerich a series of letters filled with esoteric language, references to guiding masters, prophecies, and coded nicknames, material that read less like standard political correspondence and more like something out of a spiritual pen-pal relationship between two men convinced they were tapped into forces beyond ordinary understanding. The letters remained largely private for years, tucked away as an embarrassing footnote known mostly to insiders, until copies surfaced during Wallace's 1948 presidential campaign under the Progressive Party banner, when political opponents obtained and published portions of them specifically to portray Wallace as flaky, unstable, and unfit for serious leadership. The press had a field day. Newspapers printed excerpts, calling him a mystic dreamer who addressed Roerich in strange spiritual terms and seemed to believe in prophetic visions guiding American foreign policy. Some historians argue the letters were harmless expressions of Wallace's genuine, if unconventional, spiritual curiosity, the kind of private musings that most public figures manage to keep hidden from the press entirely. Others contend the letters revealed something more troubling, a susceptibility to fringe ideas that raised legitimate questions about his judgment during a period when he'd held enormous influence as vice president and briefly as a contender for the presidency itself. Wallace never fully disowned the letters, though he expressed regret over how they were used against him, insisting the spiritual language had been taken out of context and weaponized unfairly by rivals determined to sink his independent campaign. The scandal effectively torpedoed what little momentum his third-party run had, reinforcing an image of him as an out-of-touch idealist rather than a serious statesman. It remains one of the strangest scandals in vice presidential history, a reminder that even brilliant, accomplished public servants sometimes leave behind private paper trails they'd very much prefer stayed buried. And speaking of vice presidents whose sudden elevation to the presidency came with an equally sudden and jarring introduction to the nation's most closely guarded secret, Harry Truman's first days in office revealed just how deliberately he'd been kept in the dark. 32. Harry Truman's Manhattan Project surprise. Harry Truman served as vice president under Franklin Roosevelt for less than 3 months in early 1945. A former Missouri senator chosen largely as a compromise candidate to balance competing factions within the Democratic Party rather than as someone Roosevelt intended to groom for eventual succession. When Roosevelt died suddenly in April 1945, Truman later claimed he had virtually no knowledge of the Manhattan Project, the massive top-secret program racing to develop an atomic bomb, despite the fact that as vice president he technically stood one heartbeat away from the presidency the entire time it was underway. Truman said Secretary of War Henry Stimson briefed him on the weapon's existence only after he'd already been sworn in as president, presenting him with the staggering reality that the United States possessed a device capable of destruction on a scale never before seen in human history. Some historians find this level of exclusion genuinely remarkable, arguing it reflects just how compartmentalized and secretive Roosevelt's administration operated, treating even the vice president as someone without a need to know despite his constitutional proximity to ultimate authority. Others suggest Truman may have received vague hints or partial information beforehand that he later downplayed, whether out of genuine forgetfulness or a desire to distance himself from any implication that he'd been positioned as merely a rubber stamp for decisions already made by Roosevelt's inner circle. Whatever the precise truth, Truman found himself thrust into one of the most consequential decisions in world history within mere months of learning the program even existed, ultimately authorizing the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The speed of that transition, from being kept largely uninformed to making a decision that would define the rest of the 20th century, remains a striking illustration of how precarious and thin the flow of critical information to vice presidents could be during moments of national crisis. It raises uncomfortable questions about how prepared any vice president truly is for the responsibilities that can land on them without warning, questions that continue to shape discussions about presidential succession planning to this day. And speaking of vice presidents whose age at the time of their inauguration raised eyebrows and prompted plenty of commentary about stamina and suitability for high office, Alben Barkley entered the role well past the point most politicians consider retirement. 33. Alben Barkley's record age. Alben Barkley served as vice president under Harry Truman starting in 1949, a folksy, well-liked Kentucky senator known for his sharp wit and decades of experience navigating the machinery of Congress before finally accepting the vice presidential nomination relatively late in his long political career. At 71 years old, when inaugurated, Barkley became the oldest person to assume the vice presidency up to that point in American history, a distinction that drew considerable attention and no small amount of skepticism from commentators wondering whether someone his age could handle the demands of the office. However largely ceremonial those demands were often assumed to be. Some observers at the time framed his age as reassuring rather than concerning, pointing to his decades of legislative savvy and deep relationships across the political spectrum as assets that outweighed any worries about physical limitations. Others saw it as emblematic of a broader pattern in which the vice presidency often served as a kind of dignified retirement post for long-serving party loyalists, rather than a genuine training ground for future presidential leadership. Barkley reportedly embraced the role with good humor, famously courting and marrying a much younger widow while in office, a romance that generated its own share of headlines and light-hearted public fascination given the age difference involved. He served out his term without major incident, and afterward briefly attempted a run for the presidency in 1952, though his age worked against him in a contest ultimately shaped by newer, younger political faces emerging within the party. Historians still debate whether Barkley's tenure meaningfully advanced the modern vice presidency or simply reinforced its reputation as a largely symbolic capstone role reserved for elder statesmen nearing the end of their careers. His record for oldest vice president stood for decades before eventually being surpassed, but at the time, his inauguration prompted genuine public conversation about whether there should be practical limits on how old someone could be when stepping into a position just one heartbeat from the presidency itself. And speaking of vice presidents whose foreign travels turned into genuine physical danger, rather than the usual polite diplomatic photo ops, Richard Nixon's tour of Latin America nearly got him and his wife killed by an enraged crowd. 34. Richard Nixon's Venezuela attack. Richard Nixon served as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower starting in 1953, and in 1958 he embarked on a goodwill tour of South America intended to shore up relations with countries increasingly suspicious of American influence and increasingly resentful of U.S. support for friendly dictatorships throughout the region. The tour went poorly almost from the start, with protesters in Peru spitting on Nixon and pelting his car, but it reached a genuinely terrifying climax in Caracas, Venezuela, where a mob surrounded his motorcade, smashed windows, rocked the vehicle back and forth, and came dangerously close to overturning it entirely with Nixon and his wife Pat trapped inside. Secret Service agents reportedly believed for several tense minutes that Nixon might actually be killed, drawing their weapons and preparing for the possibility that the crowd would breach the vehicle before help arrived. Eisenhower took the threat seriously enough that he positioned U.S. military forces nearby, ready to intervene if the situation in Caracas escalated further, a response that underscored just how close the incident came to becoming an international crisis rather than a diplomatic embarrassment. Some historians frame the attack as a direct consequence of years of American support for Venezuela's recently deposed dictator, arguing that the crowd's fury reflected legitimate grievances about U.S. foreign policy rather than random anti-American sentiment. Others point out that Nixon himself seemed to internalize the experience as proof of Latin America's vulnerability to communist agitation, a framing that arguably shaped his hardline anti-communist instincts for years afterward, including his later involvement in Cold War operations throughout the hemisphere. Nixon returned home shaken but largely unscathed, and the incident actually boosted his political standing domestically, with Americans rallying around images of their vice president having survived a mob attack while representing the country abroad. It remains one of the most physically dangerous moments any sitting vice president has ever experienced on foreign soil, a stark reminder that the office's ceremonial diplomatic duties could occasionally turn into genuine life-threatening situations with almost no warning at all. And speaking of vice presidents who refused to simply fade into ceremonial irrelevance once they took the oath of office, Lyndon Johnson brought decades of legislative muscle into a role that had rarely been used for anything beyond breaking Senate ties. 35. Lyndon Johnson's expanded vice presidency. Lyndon Johnson served as vice president under John F. Kennedy starting in 1961, arriving in the role after years as one of the most powerful and effective Senate majority leaders in American history, a background that made the traditionally toothless vice presidency feel almost like a demotion for someone accustomed to controlling the legislative agenda itself. Rather than accepting a purely ceremonial position, Johnson worked to carve out genuine influence within the Kennedy administration, leveraging his deep relationships with senators and representatives to help push forward major legislative priorities that the young administration needed passed. Kennedy reportedly relied on Johnson's insider knowledge of Congress, using him as a crucial back channel to gauge how bills might be received and how to navigate the personalities and rivalries that Johnson understood better than almost anyone in Washington. Some historians credit Johnson with quietly reshaping expectations for what the vice presidency could accomplish, arguing that his behind-the-scenes advocacy helped smooth the path for civil rights legislation and other priorities that Kennedy's team pursued during those years. Others suggest the relationship between the two men remained tense and somewhat distant, with Johnson privately frustrated by his diminished status after having wielded so much direct power in the Senate, and Kennedy's inner circle sometimes viewing him as an outsider from a different political tradition. Johnson attended National Security Council meetings, took on diplomatic assignments abroad, and chaired committees on space exploration and equal employment opportunity, positioning himself as more active than most of his predecessors, even if he never held the kind of direct authority he'd grown accustomed to as majority leader. When he suddenly ascended to the presidency after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Johnson's years of quiet legislative maneuvering as vice president arguably paid off, allowing him to pass sweeping civil rights and social welfare legislation with a speed that surprised many observers. His vice presidency is often cited as an early example of the office evolving into something with genuine substance rather than pure ceremony, a shift that later vice presidents would continue to build upon in the decades that followed. And speaking of vice presidents caught between personal conviction and public loyalty during one of the most divisive conflicts in American history, Hubert Humphrey found himself defending a war he privately doubted. 36. Hubert Humphrey's Vietnam descent. Hubert Humphrey served as vice president under Lyndon Johnson starting in 1965, a longtime champion of civil rights and progressive causes, who found his loyalty tested almost immediately by the escalating conflict in Vietnam that would come to define and ultimately damage his political legacy. According to accounts from aides and later historical analysis, Humphrey privately expressed serious reservations to Johnson about escalating American military involvement, reportedly warning that pouring more troops and resources into Vietnam risked disaster both militarily and politically, concerns that echoed doubts held by other officials within the administration. Johnson, according to multiple accounts, responded to this dissent with anger, reportedly freezing Humphrey out of key foreign policy discussions for a period of time as punishment for stepping out of line, a move that apparently taught Humphrey a lasting lesson about the limits of vice presidential independence. From that point forward, Humphrey became one of the administration's most visible public defenders of the war, delivering speeches and giving interviews that expressed confidence in the policy even as the conflict grew increasingly unpopular and casualties mounted on both sides. Some historians argue this represented a profound betrayal of Humphrey's own convictions, a capitulation driven by ambition and fear of losing influence within an administration he still hoped would eventually nominate him for the presidency. Others suggest his public support reflected genuine, if reluctant, loyalty to a president he'd served for years, along with a belief that internal dissent achieved more than public rebellion ever could within the confines of the office he held. Whatever his true internal calculus, the contradiction between his private doubts and public defense of the war followed him into his own 1968 presidential campaign, where anti-war voters viewed him with deep suspicion despite his eventual attempts to distance himself from Johnson's policies. Humphrey narrowly lost that election to Richard Nixon, and many historians point to his Vietnam entanglement as a decisive factor in that defeat. His experience remains a cautionary tale about the political costs vice presidents can pay when forced to publicly champion policies they privately doubt, a tension that continues to define the awkward balancing act inherent to the office itself. And speaking of vice presidents whose personal conduct eventually caught up with them in spectacular fashion, Spiro Agnew's departure from office remains one of the strangest exits in American political history. 37. Spiro Agnew's resignation deal. Spiro Agnew served as vice president under Richard Nixon starting in 1969, building a reputation as one of the administration's most combative and outspoken defenders, frequently attacking the media and anti-war protesters with a level of bombast that made him a favorite among certain segments of the Republican base. Behind the scenes, however, federal prosecutors in Maryland had been quietly building a case against Agnew related to his time as Baltimore County executive and later governor, alleging that he had accepted bribes from contractors in exchange for government contracts, payments that reportedly continued even after he became vice president. Rather than face a prolonged legal battle that risked dragging down an administration already sinking under the weight of Watergate, Agnew agreed in 1973 to plead no contest to a single charge of federal income tax evasion, a deal that allowed him to resign quietly without formally admitting to the more serious bribery allegations that prosecutors had assembled against him. Some historians argue the plea deal represented remarkably lenient treatment for a sitting vice president, suggesting that the Justice Department wanted the scandal resolved as quickly and quietly as possible given the mounting chaos already surrounding Nixon's presidency. Others point out that Agnew maintained his innocence regarding the bribery claims for the rest of his life, framing the tax charge as a face-saving compromise rather than any real admission of wrongdoing on his part. Agnew became the second vice president in American history to resign, and the circumstances made him the first to do so under the shadow of a criminal investigation, a distinction that overshadowed much of his earlier political career. The resignation created an unprecedented situation, forcing the country to test a constitutional mechanism that had never actually been used before to fill a vacant vice presidency. Agnew largely disappeared from public life afterward, occasionally resurfacing to insist he had been treated unfairly, while historians continue to debate how much of the case against him reflected genuine corruption versus political convenience given the era's chaotic climate. And speaking of the untested constitutional machinery that Agnew's resignation forced into action, the man chosen to replace him became a walking case study in unelected power. 38. Gerald Ford's unelected vice presidency. Gerald Ford became vice president in 1973 after Nixon nominated him to fill the vacancy left by Agnew's resignation, marking the first time the 25th Amendment's provision for replacing a vice president was actually put into practice since its ratification in 1967. Ford, a longtime Republican congressman from Michigan known for his reputation as a steady and relatively uncontroversial legislator, was confirmed by both chambers of Congress, a process that itself represented uncharted territory since no vice president had ever been selected this way rather than through a national election. Some observers at the time viewed Ford's selection as a deliberately safe choice, suggesting Nixon wanted someone unlikely to draw additional scrutiny during an administration already drowning in the Watergate scandal. Others argue Ford's reputation for honesty and institutional respect made him a genuinely reassuring figure for a country increasingly anxious about the integrity of its highest offices. Barely 8 months after taking office, Ford found himself elevated again, this time to the presidency itself, following Nixon's resignation in August 1974, making him the only person in American history to hold both the vice presidency and presidency without ever having been elected to either position by the national electorate. Some historians frame this as a triumph of constitutional design, arguing that the mechanisms put in place after Kennedy's assassination worked exactly as intended during a moment of genuine crisis. Others suggest the entire sequence exposed uncomfortable questions about legitimacy and public trust, given that the country's two highest offices changed hands without a single vote being cast by ordinary Americans during that transition. Ford's presidency began under this unusual cloud, and his controversial pardon of Nixon shortly afterward only intensified debates about whether the unelected path he'd traveled to the Oval Office had been handled appropriately. His unusual ascent remains a unique chapter in the history of the vice presidency, one entirely dependent on a constitutional provision that had never before been tested under real pressure. And speaking of vice presidents whose resumes included investigating some of the very intelligence agencies they would later oversee from a position of executive power, Nelson Rockefeller's path to the vice presidency ran directly through the CIA's darkest secrets. 39. Nelson Rockefeller's Commission. Nelson Rockefeller became vice president in 1974 after Ford selected him to fill the vacancy left by his own unexpected elevation to the presidency, making Rockefeller the second vice president in American history to reach the office through appointment rather than election. A striking coincidence given how recently the country had witnessed the same process with Ford himself. Before assuming this role, Rockefeller had been tapped to chair a presidential commission investigating domestic activities conducted by the CIA, an assignment that placed him squarely at the center of growing public concern about intelligence agencies potentially operating far beyond their intended boundaries within the United States. The commission examined allegations that the CIA had engaged in illegal surveillance of American citizens, experimented with mind control programs, and conducted operations that violated the agency's original charter, which had been designed to focus exclusively on foreign intelligence rather than domestic activities. Some observers at the time questioned whether Rockefeller, given his deep ties to the political and financial establishment, could realistically deliver a truly independent and unflinching investigation into agencies so closely intertwined with the government he was about to help lead. Others argue the commission's findings, while criticized by some as incomplete, nevertheless confirmed enough troubling activity to justify further congressional investigations that followed shortly afterward, expanding public understanding of just how far certain programs had strayed from their original intent. Rockefeller's transition from commission chairman to vice president raised eyebrows among critics who saw an inherent conflict in someone investigating intelligence abuses one year and then serving as the country's second highest executive the very next, potentially overseeing some of the same agencies and personnel implicated in his own findings. Supporters countered that Rockefeller's establishment credentials and institutional experience made him uniquely qualified to navigate such a delicate and politically charged assignment without triggering unnecessary panic among allies or adversaries abroad. Whatever the true balance between genuine oversight and political convenience, Rockefeller's commission remains a notable, if often overlooked, chapter in the broader story of America's uneasy reckoning with its own intelligence apparatus during the 1970s. And speaking of vice presidents who quietly built the infrastructure future occupants of the office would rely on for decades, Walter Mondale's tenure transformed what the vice presidency actually looked like on a day-to-day basis. 40. Walter Mondale's West Wing office. Walter Mondale became vice president in 1977 under Jimmy Carter, and almost immediately the two men began reshaping a position that had historically been treated as little more than ceremonial padding, a job so famously powerless that John Nance Garner had once described it as not being worth a bucket of warm spit. Carter offered Mondale something no vice president had ever really been given before, an actual office inside the West Wing itself, just steps away from the Oval Office, rather than the traditional space across the street, or tucked into the old executive office building, where previous vice presidents had often been physically and symbolically separated from real decision-making. Mondale also received regular weekly lunches with Carter, unrestricted access to the president's daily briefings, and a standing invitation to weigh in on major policy discussions rather than being handed ceremonial duties and expected to stay quiet. Some historians argue this arrangement fundamentally redefined the office, establishing a template that nearly every vice president since has followed to varying degrees, transforming the position from a political consolation prize into a genuine advisory role at the center of executive power. Others point out that Mondale's influence depended heavily on Carter's personal willingness to share authority, meaning the arrangement reflected one specific relationship rather than any guaranteed structural shift, and that future presidents could have just as easily reverted to sidelining their vice presidents if they'd chosen to. What's harder to dispute is the practical legacy this left behind. Later vice presidents, including George H.W. Bush, Al Gore, and Dick Cheney, all inherited the West Wing office space and the expectation of regular access that Mondale had essentially invented through negotiation rather than any change in law or constitutional amendment. The vice presidency had spent nearly 2 centuries as an office defined mostly by waiting for the president to die, waiting for something to do, waiting to matter. Mondale's arrangement with Carter suggested the job could instead function as an active partnership, with real input on real decisions happening in real time. Whether every subsequent administration used that model to strengthen governance or simply to consolidate power in fewer hands remains a matter of ongoing debate among historians and political scientists. What's certain is that the physical geography of Mondale's office, just down the hall from the most powerful person in the country, symbolized a shift in how the vice presidency would be understood going forward, less a ceremonial afterthought, more a genuine second seat at the table. And speaking of vice presidents whose resumes included running one of the most secretive agencies in the federal government before ever stepping into elected office, George H. W. Bush's path to the vice presidency wound directly through Langley. 41. George H. W. Bush's CIA leadership. Before George H. W. Bush became vice president under Ronald Reagan in 1981, he served for roughly a year as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, appointed by President Gerald Ford in late 1975 during a particularly turbulent period for American intelligence agencies. The CIA at that moment was reeling from a wave of damaging revelations, including congressional investigations into assassination plots, domestic surveillance programs, and other activities that had badly eroded public trust in the agency's judgment and oversight. Bush's assignment was essentially to stabilize morale and restore some credibility to an institution that had become a symbol of unchecked government power during a decade already saturated with scandal. Some historians argue Bush approached the role with genuine restraint, working to implement reforms suggested by congressional committees and attempting to rebuild relationships between the agency and the legislators tasked with overseeing it. Others suggest his tenure was too brief and too politically cautious to meaningfully address the deeper structural problems that had allowed such abuses to occur in the first place, framing his time there as more of a public relations exercise than substantive reform. What makes Bush's CIA directorship particularly notable in hindsight is the unusual career trajectory it represents. Few political figures in American history have moved directly from leading the nation's primary intelligence agency into national elected office, and even fewer have done so on their way to eventually becoming vice president and then president themselves. Critics at the time raised concerns about intelligence officials transitioning into partisan political roles, arguing it risked blurring lines between supposedly neutral intelligence work and openly political ambition. Supporters countered that Bush's institutional experience gave him a rare and valuable perspective on national security matters once he reached higher office, arguing few vice presidents or presidents have ever understood the intelligence community's inner workings as intimately as he did. Whatever conclusion one draws, the CIA headquarters building in Langley, Virginia now bears his name, officially designated the George Bush Center for Intelligence, a permanent and somewhat unusual monument to a director who spent barely a year in the position before moving on to a political career that would eventually place him in the Oval Office itself. And speaking of vice presidents handed responsibilities that seemed almost tailor-made for late-night comedy writers before actually producing lasting policy groundwork, Dan Quayle's stewardship of America's space ambitions turned out more substantive than his public reputation suggested. 42. Dan Quayle's Space Council role. Dan Quayle served as vice president under George H. W. Bush starting in 1989. And one of his primary responsibilities involved chairing the National Space Council, a body revived after years of dormancy to coordinate space policy across various federal agencies and departments. Quayle's public image at the time was frequently defined by gaffes and media mockery, most famously an incident involving the misspelling of potato during a school visit, which overshadowed much of the substantive policy work he was actually doing behind the scenes. Under his leadership, the Space Council began pushing for greater involvement of private companies in what had traditionally been an almost exclusively government-run enterprise, advocating for policies that would eventually make commercial space launches and satellite operations more accessible to businesses rather than keeping spaceflight locked entirely within NASA and military channels. Some historians argue Quayle's work on the council represented meaningful early groundwork for what eventually became the modern commercial space industry. An industry that today includes companies capable of launching astronauts and satellites without direct government operation of the hardware involved. Others suggest the Council's influence was more limited than supporters claim, arguing that broader technological and economic trends would have pushed private space development forward, regardless of any specific vice president's involvement during this particular window. Quayle also used the position to advocate for continued funding of Space Station Freedom, the precursor program to what eventually became the International Space Station, arguing that maintaining American leadership in orbital infrastructure carried both scientific and strategic value during a period of shifting geopolitical priorities following the Cold War's conclusion. Critics at the time questioned whether a vice president so frequently ridiculed in popular media could be taken seriously on complex technical and scientific matters, while defenders pointed out that policy substance and public image are often entirely separate things, with Quayle's actual work on space policy receiving considerably more respect from industry insiders than his broader political reputation might suggest. Whether remembered primarily for spelling mishaps or for quietly steering early commercial space policy, Quayle's tenure on the National Space Council remains one of the more overlooked chapters in vice presidential history, a reminder that some of the least publicly celebrated roles occasionally produce consequences that outlast the punchlines. 43. Al Gore's budget tiebreaker. In August 1993, Vice President Al Gore did something most vice presidents never get the chance to do. He cast a tie-breaking vote in the United States Senate that actually changed the course of national policy. The vote was on President Clinton's first budget package, a sweeping piece of legislation combining tax increases, spending cuts, and deficit reduction measures that Republicans uniformly opposed. The Senate split 50-50, and under the Constitution, that meant the vice president, as president of the Senate, got to break the tie. Gore voted yes, and the budget passed by the narrowest possible margin. Some historians argue this moment demonstrated exactly why the framers gave the vice president this obscure tie-breaking power in the first place, a built-in mechanism to prevent legislative gridlock from paralyzing the government during closely divided votes. Others point out how remarkable it was that a piece of legislation this consequential, one that would shape federal tax policy and spending priorities for years, came down to a single unelected official's vote rather than a clear congressional consensus. Republicans at the time argued the budget would tank the economy with excessive taxation. Democrats argued it was necessary medicine after years of ballooning deficits. Neither side got to say they were unambiguously right, because the economic boom of the later 1990s arrived with enough other contributing factors that economists still debate how much credit the 1993 budget deserves. What's not up for debate is the raw political drama of the moment itself. Every single Republican senator voted no. Several Democrats defected as well. It came down to Gore, sitting in the presiding officer's chair, casting a vote that many pundits at the time framed as almost monarchical in its power, one person deciding the fate of legislation that had already consumed months of congressional negotiation. Gore would go on to cast additional tie-breaking votes during his time as vice president, but none carried quite the same weight or received quite the same scrutiny as this one. It's a strange quirk of American government that the vice presidency, an office frequently mocked as ceremonial and powerless, occasionally hands its occupant the single deciding vote on matters of enormous national consequence, all because of a math problem in a chamber split exactly down the middle. And speaking of vice presidents, whose whereabouts suddenly became a matter of intense secrecy rather than public record, Dick Cheney's movements after September 11th introduced most Americans to a phrase they'd never heard before. 44. Dick Cheney's secret location. In the chaotic days following the September 11th attacks, Vice President Dick Cheney was frequently relocated to what officials described only as an undisclosed location, a phrase that became something of a running joke in political circles even as it represented a very real and very serious security protocol. The relocations were part of what's known as continuity of government planning, a set of procedures designed decades earlier during the Cold War to ensure that if a catastrophic attack ever wiped out much of Washington's leadership at once, someone with constitutional authority would still be alive and capable of directing the government. Cheney and President Bush were reportedly kept physically separated for security reasons in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, a deliberate choice meant to prevent a single strike from eliminating both the president and vice president simultaneously. Some historians argue this was simply prudent crisis management, a reasonable response to a moment when nobody in government fully understood whether more attacks were coming or how coordinated the threat actually was. Others suggest the secrecy surrounding Cheney's location fed into a broader pattern during his vice presidency, one where an unusually powerful and often opaque executive branch operated with far less transparency than previous administrations, raising questions about how much the public actually deserved to know about the decision-making happening at the highest levels during a national emergency. The undisclosed location itself was widely reported to be Camp David or a secure bunker facility, though officials for years declined to confirm specifics, treating even basic details about the vice president's whereabouts as classified information. Critics argued this level of secrecy, applied to something as fundamental as knowing where the second highest official in government physically was, reflected a troubling expansion of executive privilege in the name of security. Supporters countered that revealing exact locations during an active and poorly understood threat would have been recklessly irresponsible, potentially endangering both Cheney's safety and the continuity of government. The protocols were specifically designed to protect. Whatever conclusion one draws, the phrase undisclosed location entered the American political vocabulary permanently after 2001, a small linguistic artifact of just how unprecedented and disorienting those early post-9/11 weeks felt, even for the people running the country. And speaking of vice presidents whose daily habits reflected a very different relationship with power, one built on decades of routine rather than sudden crisis, Joe Biden's transportation choices became something of a personal trademark long before he ever reached the vice presidency. 45. Joe Biden's Amtrak commute. For much of his 36 years representing Delaware in the United States Senate, Joe Biden commuted to Washington by train, riding Amtrak back and forth between Wilmington and the Capitol so consistently that railway staff reportedly knew him by name and colleagues eventually nicknamed him Amtrak Joe. The commute wasn't an untimed publicity stunt or an occasional appearance for cameras. Biden reportedly made the roughly hour-and-a-half trip regularly throughout his Senate career, allowing him to return home to Delaware most evenings, rather than maintaining a full-time residence in Washington the way many of his congressional colleagues did. Some historians and biographers argue this habit reflected a genuine personal commitment to family life, following the tragic loss of his first wife and daughter in a car accident early in his political career, a loss that reportedly shaped his desire to remain physically present for his surviving children whenever possible. Others framed the commute as a carefully cultivated element of Biden's political image, a relatable blue-collar counterpoint to the perception of Washington politicians as detached from ordinary American life, even as he simultaneously built a decades-long career inside the same institution he was symbolically distancing himself from. Both interpretations can coexist without contradicting each other. Personal necessity and political branding aren't mutually exclusive, and Biden leaned into the association enough that Amtrak itself later honored him by naming a train station in Wilmington after him. The commuting habit became considerably more complicated once Biden became vice president in 2009, given the security requirements that come with the office. Regular train travel on a public rail line presents obvious logistical challenges for anyone requiring Secret Service protection, and his travel patterns necessarily shifted toward more controlled and secure transportation methods once he held national office. Still, the Amtrak Association stuck, becoming a defining piece of his public identity for decades afterward, repeatedly referenced in campaign materials, news profiles, and even farewell tributes from railway employees who remembered him as a familiar face during his commuting years. Few vice presidential biographical details have proven as durable in the public imagination as this one, a simple train ride that somehow outlasted nearly every policy position associated with his lengthy career. And speaking of vice presidents whose personal histories became inseparable from the broader story of who gets to hold power in America, Kamala Harris didn't just join the list of vice presidents. She rewrote several categories of that list simultaneously. 46. Kamala Harris's history-making oath. When Kamala Harris was sworn in as vice president on January 20, 2021, she became the first woman to hold the office in the entire 232-year history of the United States. She also became the first Black American and the first person of South Asian descent to serve as vice president, checking 3 historic firsts in a single ceremony that had never happened before in American politics. Harris, whose mother emigrated from India and whose father emigrated from Jamaica, took her oath using 2 Bibles, one that had belonged to Regina Shelton, a family friend who helped raise her, and another that had belonged to Thurgood Marshall, the first Black Supreme Court justice. Some historians argue this moment represented a genuinely significant milestone in American representation, evidence that the highest offices in the country were finally becoming accessible to people outside the narrow demographic that had occupied them for over 2 centuries. Every previous vice president, all 48 of them before her, had been a man, and the overwhelming majority had been white. Others point out that representation alone doesn't automatically translate into policy outcomes, arguing that the symbolic significance of Harris's inauguration should be evaluated separately from questions about her actual record in office, which remains a matter of ongoing political debate depending on who you ask. Both perspectives can be true at once. The historical weight of the moment doesn't require agreement on everything that followed it. Harris herself acknowledged the significance in her victory speech, noting that while she might be the first woman in the office, she wouldn't be the last, and dedicating the moment to generations of women, including Black women and women of South Asian descent, who paved the way through decades of activism and political organizing that rarely received national recognition at the time. Her ascension also carried an unusual layer of political weight given her position as a heartbeat away from the presidency during an administration led by the oldest president in American history, a fact that fueled endless speculation and commentary about her potential future role, speculation that would only intensify as her own presidential ambitions became clearer in the years that followed. Whatever one makes of her specific tenure, the raw historical fact remains unchanged. It took until the 21st century for the vice presidency to open its doors to a woman, and when it finally happened, it happened in a way that broke multiple barriers at once rather than just one. And speaking of powers that seem almost accidental on paper, but occasionally reshape the entire direction of the country, the vice presidency comes with one constitutional function that has nothing to do with succession at all. 47. The vice president's tie-breaking power. Most people assume the vice president, as president of the Senate, gets to vote on legislation just like any senator. That assumption is wrong. The Constitution actually grants the vice president no regular vote in the Senate whatsoever. Instead, Article 1 specifically authorizes the vice president to cast a vote only in the event of a tie, making the office a kind of constitutional tiebreaker rather than a full voting member of the chamber. This might sound like a minor procedural footnote, but it has occasionally handed individual vice presidents outsized influence over major legislation, simply because the Senate happened to be evenly split at the exact moment a critical vote came up. John Adams, the very first vice president, cast 29 tie-breaking votes during his tenure, a record that stood unbroken for over 2 centuries until John C. Calhoun came close but still fell short. Some historians argue this power reflects thoughtful constitutional design, a built-in mechanism ensuring that legislative business can't grind to a permanent halt simply because a chamber happens to be perfectly divided. Others find something faintly absurd about the arrangement: an unelected official, chosen primarily as a running mate rather than for legislative expertise, occasionally deciding the fate of major national policy through a single vote cast almost by mathematical accident. The power has been used sparingly throughout history, precisely because exact ties are relatively rare in a 100-member chamber. But when they do happen, the stakes tend to be enormous. Vice presidents have used this power to pass budget packages, confirm controversial nominees, and settle disputes that senators themselves couldn't resolve through debate or compromise. Modern vice presidents have leaned on this power more frequently as the Senate has become more evenly divided along partisan lines in recent decades, turning what the framers likely imagined as an occasional procedural safeguard into a genuinely consequential political tool. It's a strange little wrinkle in American governance, proof that even the most ceremonial-seeming office in the federal government retains one very real, very sharp constitutional teeth. And speaking of constitutional gaps that nobody thought to address until reality forced the issue, the vice presidency spent nearly 2 centuries operating without any clear plan for what to do when the office itself sat completely empty. 48. The long vacancy problem. Before 1967, the Constitution contained no mechanism whatsoever for filling a vacant vice presidency. If a vice president died, resigned, or ascended to the presidency themselves, following the death of a sitting president, the office simply remained empty until the next scheduled election, sometimes for years at a stretch. This wasn't a rare hypothetical. It happened repeatedly throughout American history. John Tyler, William King, Andrew Johnson, Chester Arthur, Thomas Marshall's successors, and several others all served as vice presidents whose predecessors had died or moved up, leaving the nation without a designated second in line for extended stretches of time. In total, the vice presidency sat vacant for a combined total of roughly 37 years across American history before the problem was finally addressed. Some historians argue this gap represented a genuinely dangerous oversight in the constitutional structure, one that left the country without a clear succession plan during moments of potential crisis, particularly troubling once nuclear weapons made presidential continuity a matter of national security rather than mere political tidiness. Others suggest the framers simply never anticipated how often the office would become vacant, and that early American government functioned reasonably well without a fix because the stakes of a temporary vacancy felt lower in a slower-moving, pre-nuclear political world. The problem finally reached a breaking point after President Kennedy's assassination in 1963, when Lyndon Johnson ascended to the presidency, and the nation suddenly found itself without any vice president at all during an era defined by Cold War tensions and the very real possibility of nuclear conflict. Congress responded by passing the 25th Amendment in 1967, which finally established a clear process allowing the president to nominate a new vice president with congressional approval whenever the office became vacant. The amendment was used almost immediately, first when Gerald Ford replaced Spiro Agnew after his resignation, and again when Nelson Rockefeller replaced Ford after he ascended to the presidency following Nixon's resignation. It's a fitting bit of historical irony that the fix arrived only after a series of national traumas made the old system's flaws impossible to ignore any longer. And speaking of constitutional patches that arrived decades too late, but eventually got the job done, the amendment that fixed the vacancy problem deserves a closer look at exactly how it works. 49. The 25th Amendment Solution. Ratified in 1967, the 25th Amendment created a process for filling a vacant vice presidency, something the Constitution had somehow gone nearly 2 centuries without addressing. Under Section 2 of the amendment, whenever the vice presidency becomes vacant, the president nominates a replacement who must then be confirmed by a majority vote in both the House and the Senate. This might sound like a modest procedural fix, but it fundamentally changed how presidential succession works in America, ensuring the nation would never again drift through years without a designated second-in-command during a moment of crisis. The amendment did more than just solve the vacancy problem, though. It also formalized procedures for presidential disability, allowing the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare a president unable to discharge their duties, temporarily elevating the vice president to acting president until the disability ends. Some historians argue this provision was the amendment's real innovation, a mechanism designed specifically with an incapacitated president in mind rather than a merely absent one, addressing scenarios that had genuinely terrified officials during Eisenhower's heart attacks and Wilson's debilitating stroke decades earlier. Others point out that the disability provisions have almost never been formally invoked despite several presidents experiencing serious health episodes while in office, suggesting the political risks of declaring a sitting president incapacitated remain far higher than the framers of the amendment anticipated. The amendment's vacancy-filling mechanism, meanwhile, has been used exactly twice, both times during the tumultuous 1970s. Gerald Ford became vice president through this process after Spiro Agnew resigned amid a bribery scandal, and Ford then nominated Nelson Rockefeller to fill his own vacated vice presidency after ascending to the presidency himself following Nixon's resignation. For a brief stretch of American history, neither the president nor the vice president had been elected to their positions by the public at all, both men having reached the nation's 2 highest offices entirely through appointment and confirmation under this single amendment. Some constitutional scholars find this a remarkable testament to the amendment's flexibility, proof that the system could absorb even an unprecedented double vacancy without collapsing into chaos. Others see it as an unsettling reminder of how quickly the chain of democratic accountability can become stretched thin, with unelected officials occupying the 2 most powerful offices in the country simultaneously. Whatever conclusion you draw, the amendment remains one of the quieter but more consequential pieces of constitutional engineering in American history, sitting largely unnoticed until the exact moment the nation desperately needs it. And speaking of quiet constitutional engineering that shapes far more than most people realize, it's worth stepping back to ask what the vice presidency is actually supposed to do in the first place. 50. The vice president's hidden constitutional job. Strip away all the ceremony, the motorcades, and the modern expectation that vice presidents serve as close policy advisors, and the Constitution actually assigns the office remarkably little. The vice president's only explicit constitutional duties are presiding over the Senate and succeeding the president if the office becomes vacant. That's it. Everything else, the influential advisory roles, the diplomatic missions, the policy portfolios modern vice presidents manage, exists entirely outside the constitutional text, built up gradually through custom, presidential delegation, and personal relationships rather than any formal requirement. Some historians argue this reflects exactly what the framers intended, an office designed as a kind of constitutional standby, rather than a genuine center of power, existing mainly to ensure continuity, rather than to actively govern. Early vice presidents took this minimalism seriously, sometimes to an almost absurd degree. John Adams reportedly called the office the most insignificant one that ever the invention of man devised, and for much of American history, vice presidents had little to do beyond presiding over Senate sessions and waiting, sometimes for years, in case tragedy or resignation called them upward. Others suggest the framers simply failed to anticipate how the office might evolve, leaving a vacuum that later presidents and vice presidents filled according to their own political needs and personal chemistry. The transformation into a genuinely influential position happened gradually and unevenly, accelerating significantly in the modern era, as vice presidents like Walter Mondale, Al Gore, and Dick Cheney took on substantial advisory roles that would have been unrecognizable to the office's earliest occupants. None of that expanded influence is constitutionally guaranteed, though. A president could, in theory, sideline a vice president entirely, restricting them to nothing but ceremonial Senate duties, and the vice president would have no constitutional recourse whatsoever. The entire modern vice presidency, with its national security briefings, foreign trips, and West Wing offices, rests on nothing more than tradition and the goodwill of whoever happens to occupy the Oval Office. It's a strange foundation for what has become one of the most closely watched positions in American government, a reminder that plenty of the power we assume exists in Washington was never actually written down anywhere at all.